As I said in the previous video, I'm now going to look at looping arrays. So we've already looked at while loops before. How can I, for example, loop through this array of grades? So again, a quick recap on with a while loop. So we need an index, and on each loop of this while loop, or as I'm going to show you in a minute, a for loop, we need to use this index here like as a variable, and we're going to update it by adding 1 to it, and then it will get out each element. So we could do it like this. We could have a counter, and we could start that at 0. And then we're going to, in our while loop, we're going to have a condition. We're going to keep looping until counter, or while counter, is less than grades.length. So we're using this length variable. And then we're going to print out console.writeLine each grades element, and using the counter as the index in the square brackets. An alternative way of printing out every single element in an array is, if you go to W3C schools, we could use a for loop. For loops consist of a keyword for and then 3 statements. One way of doing a for loop does anyway. The first one defines what will be executed for the code block. So here we define our counter. The second one will define a condition, and the third one will define what we need to execute after the code block has executed. So what do I mean by, so we write for the keyword, then we create our counter. Now I'm going to call mine I. It's local to this loop. And then I'm going to test whether I is less than, let's just say 5 for now. And then on each loop, I'm going to add 1 to this variable. At the end of each loop, I'm going to add 1 to the counter. Now this is our code block. This is where we do our code. So I could copy this line here, where I'm printing out the grades, each grade. And instead of counter, which we're using here, I'm going to use this locally defined index I. And if I print this out now, you'll see exactly the same things that happened. It will print out all of these, line after line after line, and then it will print out them again, line after line after line. So it will print it out twice. One problem is we didn't update the counter in the while loop. So what's happening here is I've got this counter, I'm not updating it, so I'm stuck in an infinite loop. The counter is always stuck at 0, so it's just going to print the first element out, and it's never going to be greater than grades.length because we don't add to the counter. So this is possibly one disadvantage of while loops. There's a lot of setup you have to do, but if you use a for loop, it's kind of like you have to set all these things up in a for loop, or else it just won't work. So we're not going to get these problems where we get stuck in an infinite loop because we didn't update some kind of a counter. So to fix that, I just do add 1 to the counter. And if I run that again, as I said, you'll print out the list twice, 1 inside the for loop and 1 inside the while loop. And this will work now and not get stuck on the first element because I'll be updating the counter every time. There we go. So 50, 60, it's set up to 110. And then it prints it out again. So one problem is, well, I may often not know how long an array is. So in the same way I used grades.length to check whether the counter is less than that, I can use this property here in my for loop to make sure that the loop will keep looping over this piece of code until we get to the end of the array. So it could be 1,000,000 items long or 1,000,001 items long, but if I use grades.length, it will keep looping until it gets to until I is whilst I is less than grades.length. Remember, we don't ever want I to be the length of this because we'll get an array out of bounds exception, which we talked about here when we were trying to put index 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but there was only index 1, 2, 3, 1, 2 up to 3, or index 4, wasn't it? So this loop here will now loop through the length of grades that's any length. If I copied this information here and I just pasted it in, just pasted more elements in, I could put hundreds of elements if I wanted. Doesn't really matter how many I put in. It's only going to loop up to from 0 up to the length of however long that array is. Okay, so this is looping with a while loop. This is looping with a for loop. There's also a do while loop that's probably worth mentioning. Do while is where you want to execute the code in the code block once, and then you want to check the condition. So you say you, and then you put a semicolon. So this will do the code in the code block once, and then do the condition. So it will loop at least once. Whereas this one may not loop at all if this condition is false. This one will loop. It will be guaranteed to loop until I, which is ever increasing on each loop, is increased until it gets to be larger than grades.length. So there are some challenges at the end of this. See if you can find the minimum maximum element in an array. And I put a link to a Code Wars challenge that is similar to that. For example, and then after that, there's another challenge where you have to calculate the average grade. So let's focus on that one. So if you look at all these grades here, how can I add up each one of these grades inside of the loop, inside of this for loop? How can I create the total of it? And then how can I calculate what the average is? So I'd need to divide the total by the number of grades. So how can you manipulate things in this loop? Say we wanted to we need to write some code in here. And let's just look at this one for now. So I'll give you an example of this one and then go and look at this exercise and see if you can figure out how to add up the total inside of that loop. So we need to create a variable before called minimum is 0. And then what we're going to do is we're going to look at every single element in here. And if we ever find an element that is larger, that is less than minimum, then we're going to update minimum. So I think minimum should be quite a high number. So let's say it starts off at, say, 200, right? And then we're going to say if grades I, if that is less than minimum, which it will be at first, we're going to update minimum to be grades at position I. So we're going to update that minimum value. And then let's do a console.writeLine. And we'll print out that value there. Let's make the array a bit smaller. So we've just got a few elements. Obviously, the smallest element is going to be the first one. Let's add an extra one, 30. So we run this. And what it's going to do is going to loop through every single element in our grades list. It's going to test whether that is less than the minimum. So it will be at first. So the new minimum will become 50, and then it will move on to the next number 60, and it will test is 60 less than the minimum. It isn't, so it won't update it. Then it will go to 70, 100, 110. The last element will be 30. 30 is going to be less than the minimum, so therefore we're going to update what that minimum is by updating the value equal to the grade at that index I. I'm not sure why it's taking so long. Maybe you can think of how you could then test to find the maximum. So that's how you find the minimum. But what would I need to do to find the maximum? And then, as I said, there's this extra exercise at the bottom. There's quite a few, but just focus on this one for now. And it should probably take you a bit of time. How can we loop through that array of grades, add them all up so we get a total, and then calculate the average? So sometimes Replic's a little bit slow. So if I start it again, I restart it and see whether it will run now. I think perhaps. No, I thought it was getting stuck in this do while loop, but I'm not sure it will. Anyway, I guarantee you that this code will work. That's how I do it for the minimum. How do you do it for the maximum? And then how do you, here we go. So we're printing out everything at first, and then we're also printing out again. It didn't say it, but I believe this is it printing out the minimum here, and it's got the right minimum. We could update that, and we could actually put minimum and then sort of add that on, concatenate that string. So yeah, have a go at those two puzzles, which are here. We've done the minimum, and now find the maximum.